Here's a chart showing healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP. New Zealand didn't have any data for 1960 or 1965. That's why it looks weird, and I couldn't remove the whole. And I couldn't remove the individual points, and so I just had to leave it like that. There's a general upward trend for all states in this little analysis, but the U.S. breaks away from the pack at around 1970. Here we have state spending as a percentage of total medical service spending. And the U.S. has risen to about 45% in 2007 versus 81.7% in Britain in 2007. So even if you think that the NHS is a fantastic thing, it's only a matter of degree. Data for all this stuff is in the description. In 2007, we can deduce that the U.S. government spent about $3,596 per person on medical services, while Britain spent $2,444, Canada spent $2,726, and Australia spent $2,176 per person. Despite this, in the U.S., $4,324 per capita was spent in the private sector, compared to $548 in the UK, $1,169 in Canada, and $1,024 in Australia. The U.S. government spends more per person on medical services than the British government. And here are the physicians per 1,000 people in each state. And despite the U.S. spending much more, they don't have any more physicians than in the UK. Now, before you hoot and holler and clamor for more state control, let's look into this. Why is so much spent on medical services in the U.S.? Well, in Britain, the NHS acts as a price control on medical services. This keeps prices low, but everyone in the UK wants to use the medical services that are now either artificially cheap or free. The result is long waiting lines and sometimes just outright denial of services. In fact, by denying services, the NHS can lower the wait times of the remaining patients. And so a lot of times you'll hear how the NHS has greatly improved wait times. And they'll put up a little chart like this, and it's like, well, what happened? Did people just stop getting ill? Or did they just have a massive increase in the number of physicians? No, they just denied more people. Or less people applied or something. That's the only sensible way you could see it happening. And if you want to say less people got ill or there was a massive increase in physicians, well, we know empirically there was not a massive increase in physicians, and so very simple, they just denied more people coverage outright. And this is what occurs in Canada as well, and my guess is this is what happens in Australia and New Zealand. In 1972, Richard Nixon imposed price controls on gasoline, and the result was waiting lines and rationing. This is what happens with the NHS and healthcare. Now, you can call these rationing mechanisms death panels or not, but there's not an infinite supply of medical services, and they are going to be rationed one way or another. In the United States, there are a lot less price controls, and the result is that the price of medical services are bid up and up and up. On a free market, this would be no problem. Right? There's a huge profit incentive for any would-be doctors because there's so much being spent on medical services that if you become a doctor, you'll make a whole lot of money. And so on a free market, you would see tons of Americans becoming doctors wanting to get those big paychecks. And this increase in the supply of doctors would drive the price of medical services down in the same way an increase in any supply of product would drive the price of that product down. Unfortunately, thanks to the lobbying efforts of the American Medical Association, the supply of doctors is legally restricted in the United States. It's also legally restricted in the United Kingdom. See description for details on how this is done. Because of state, quote, regulation, close quote, the supply of doctors is artificially low, meaning that prices in the U.S. will either be as high as they are forever, or you'll have to institute price controls and have something like the UK and just have extremely long wait times. If the restriction of supply was removed in the United Kingdom, then wait times would shorten, and if the restriction in supply was removed in the US, prices would go down. I personally don't care if the US goes to an NHS-style medical system. I know a lot of people will find that very odd, but I really don't care. That system has some pros and cons depending on how rich you are, and on the whole may actually be better than the current state of affairs in the United States. The problem, though, is that the current problems in the U.S. are being blamed on the free market, when the real culprit is the state and the American Medical Association for limiting the supply of medical services. In America, it's devil take the hindmost, and the reason people pay so much in the US is because they are paying to not die. In Britain, instead of devil take the hindmost, it's random death. Right? It's bureaucratic death. So now, don't be fooled by coverage. There are about as many physicians per 1,000 people in Britain as in the US. There is just as much coverage in Britain as in the US. There is one way to solve this problem, and that way is freedom. Remove the restrictions on supply, and the supply of doctors will rise, and the price will fall without having to resort to rationing and those death panels.